Thanks for coming back to another episode of Pitch It, a fintech conversation amongst founders, investors, and friends. I'm your host, Todd Anderson, Chief Content Officer at Fintech Nexus. And what we do is we take a peek behind the curtain. What motivates someone to start a company? How do investors make the right bet? What do accelerators do during and help enabling the process of growing your company? How do banks think of founders? Not to mention, we try to have some fun, and what you'll see is we'll also do some special episodes. We have some new features coming. So stick with us, and you'll get all you'll need to know about the fintech startup landscape. Pitch It is really a part of a larger podcast network here at Fintech Nexus. You can go to my colleague Peter, our co-founder and chairman, for Fintech One-on-One. You can subscribe to his feed, or we have our newest podcast by one of our writers, Isabel Castro, the Fintech Coffee Break. For everything produced by Fintech Nexus, you can check out Fintech Nexus Podcast, which is really our content fire hose. All shows, webinar replays, even in-person event content, not to mention our weekly news show. As always, we hope that you rate the show and write a review. I try to really take listener feedback seriously, and as it helps make the show better. You can also follow the podcast and all of our podcasts on the feed of your choice, whether it be Apple, Spotify, wherever you like to listen, or come directly to news.fintechnexus.com. Now, let's get on with the show. On today's episode, I'm joined by Susan Tanski, co-founder and head of strategy at Sunstone Credit. Susan and I talked about, the origin story behind Sunstone and why they focused on commercial solar versus residential solar. What initially drove her interest in, being in the climate and sustainability space. How Sunstone is helping small and medium-sized businesses finance solar power, the $1 trillion opportunity in commercial solar, raising capital, and much, much more. Before we get to the episode, a couple of short PSAs. We're still accepting applications for Pitch It at Fintech Nexus USA. Head to fintechnexus.com for details. In the show notes, we will have the application link. And if you want to sponsor an episode, come on as a guest or sponsor one of our many digital or in-person offerings. Feel free to reach out anytime. It's Todd, T-O-D-D, at fintechnexus.com. Now, without further ado, Susan Tanski, co-founder and head of strategy at Sunstone Credit. Enjoy the show. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Susan. How are you?
I'm doing well, Todd. Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. So I like to start the show. Tell the audience, tell me a little bit about yourself. What's your professional journey been like before Sunstone, and what kind of brought you to the point you're at today?
Sure. So I have been in financial services my whole career, and I've worked kind of the full spectrum of banking. So I started in consumer banking. I spent some time in commercial banking and also investment banking. And immediately prior to Sunstone, I was actually a co-founder of a SPAC. And we were the first sustainability-focused SPAC, which is kind of how I got an interest in solar and, all things clean energy. And that actually led me to Sunstone, because I reconnected with one of our founders at Sunstone, Wilson Chang, who he co-founded a company called Sunlight Financial, which is a residential solar finance company. And they actually went public in a SPAC deal. And so we kind of were, talking about that. And he said, look, I'm about to start a new company that is commercial solar finance. Would you be interested in joining? And so that's how I got to Sunstone.
And so when I like to ask this question in terms of, the entrepreneurship journey, did you see yourself eventually getting to the point of starting your own venture or co-founding a venture with fellow founders, or was the banking, the career kind of taking on a certain path, and this opportunity just jumped at you?
Yeah. So I always wanted to do something entrepreneurial. I think that, I'll start with saying I think the best career advice I ever received was actually from David Solomon. So the CEO of Goldman Sachs. I was in investment banking at Goldman right out of business school. And on like our first day in orientation, one of the things he said to us was, everyone wants to be an entrepreneur. Everyone wants to start a really successful business, be the next Google or, Uber or Amazon, whatever. But you really need to build a foundation first and build a network, get hard skills, learn how to do something before you go out and be an entrepreneur. And so, his point was Goldman's a great place to do that, which I agree with. But I'm really grateful that I had, 10 plus years in financial services, really learning how to do something and learning about an industry. And I think I can bring that skill set to being an entrepreneur, which just makes me that much better. And it's also the network too. I mean, like just the network, I think is worth its weight in gold. And so I'm so glad I have that from all of my previous roles.
So tell us, what does Sunstone Credit do, and when answering that, how did you ultimately come to the name Sunstone?
Yeah, so I actually don't know how the Sunstone Credit name came to be. It is a great name, though. I love it. But we are a commercial solar loan platform. So if you are, a hotel, or you own a warehouse, and you want to put solar on your facility, we will finance that for you with really straightforward, easy to understand loan financing.
Now, what made the commercial market more interesting versus, say, the residential market? Obviously, there's some players in the residential market, but there's every house doesn't have solar panels on it yet today. So what made the commercial side versus the residential side more appealing?
Yeah. And so let me get into maybe a little bit of the origin story, because I think it's
Sure.
really interesting, and I think it answers that question as well. So one of our co-founders, Josh Goldberg, who's also our CEO, he founded a solar company several years ago that installed solar for both houses and commercial properties. And back then, there was really no way to finance your solar system if you wanted to own it yourself. So you could pay cash, obviously, for your system, or you could have a third party own the system, which is kind of crazy when you think about it, right? Because you own your house and you're letting someone put something on your roof, and then they're going to sell power to you. It's a very strange arrangement. So he was like, we really need to find a way to finance these systems for our customers that is just, a simple loan where the customer can own the system themselves, but pay for it over time. And so he partnered up with Wilson, who was at a private equity firm at the time. And that private equity firm started offering solar loans to Josh's customers. And over time, they realized, well, why are we just doing this for, Josh's customers? We should do this for everyone. And so that grew into Sunlight Financial, which is the residential solar loan company that I mentioned earlier that went public a couple of years ago. And so they did that, and others also entered the residential solar finance market. And, that was, I want to say like almost 10 years ago. And that market has really flourished. And there are a number of players who are kind of operating in that space. And then at the other end of the market, you have, your big utility scale solar projects. You have your Walmarts and Targets of the world. Like, it's going to be so easy for them to get financing if they want to put, solar on their roof. But there's this huge segment in the middle that, no one's offering financing to. And I think the reason for that is the underwriting for small businesses is a little bit more complicated. And so, this residential solar finance problem was really solved first, but there are a lot of commercial customers that want to go solar that need solar loan financing. And so Sunstone is really the first company to enter that space and solve that problem.
And how do you ultimately underwrite the borrower? Is there personal guarantees? Are you kind of underwriting them in a way of underwriting the owner of the business, and it's kind of like a de facto consumer loan? How do you look at the business, and how do you examine the business when thinking about lending to them?
Yeah. So on the point of personal guarantees, no. So our product has no personal guarantee required, and we really are underwriting the business itself and the merits of the business. And I would say there are two main components to our underwriting process. So the first is just looking at the business itself, making sure that they have, at the most basic level. Obviously, there are a lot of things that go into our credit scorecard, but I would say at the most basic level, are they generating sufficient cash to cover the loan payments on their Sunstone loan?
Yep.
And then the other piece that's really critical to solar is, does the solar system actually save the customer money? So that's like really at its most base level, the reason why customers go solar, right? You're saving on your utility bill, you're getting tax credits. In certain markets, you're getting state and local credits. So why would you install solar if, at the end of the day, those aren't offsetting the cost of your system? So we just want to make sure that that's the case.
So when doing research for the episode, I saw that you have some companies that are excluded that you serve, and obviously the other type would be, maybe companies like ours that are in a giant office building, but we don't own the roof or anything like that, and so it's hard to finance companies that might have an office space in the building. But what are some of the exclusions on the types of companies? Why exclude some types of companies?
Yeah, so we actually don't have many exclusions from an industry perspective. So, for example, we're not going to lend to someone who's in the firearms business, someone who is running a payday lending operation, those kind of things, which are, pretty typical bank exclusions. But other than that, we have approved projects for a wide variety of industries. And so, things like I mentioned warehouses and hotels earlier, those are seem kind of standard, but then, we've done projects for veterinarians and, roller skating rink, and it's really like just very interesting industries and businesses. So no real exclusions on the industry front.
Is there like a typical borrower? Like, is it a business that generates X amount of money, or is it the typical Main Street business that kind of has their own storefront? Is there kind of an ideal customer that you've found over time has kind of been the one that tends to go this route?
No, and I would say there really isn't a typical customer, which has just been so interesting. There are so many different businesses that see the value of solar and want to go solar. I will say, I think when you talk about the SMB space, you tend to think of like the mom and pop shop on the corner. That's less of the kind of business that we're lending to. Most of our businesses are more in the like medium size range. They are established. They've been around for a while. And so, I would say that's kind of the only like standard criteria that we really think of. But you asked about office buildings. We can actually lend to tenants. So if you're a long-term tenant in a space, as long as your landlord consents to putting the solar on, we can install a system for you, and you can be one of our borrowers. But what typically happens with, like if you're thinking of like a skyscraper in Manhattan, that's not going to be a great candidate for solar, because just the roof space relative to the square footage isn't very high. But, if you're a suburban office park with a lot of different tenants, like that actually could be a great candidate for solar.
Interesting. And what have you seen so far? You mentioned the offsets and saving money. Is there kind of an average that you have found in terms of savings if a business moves to solar?
Yeah, it really depends on the market, I would say. So I say there are kind of three different uh, qualities that make a market or a region a good place for solar. So, I mean, solar is possible in all 50 states or really anywhere. But, it tends to be a function of how expensive is power, how much sun do you get, and are there state and local incentives that, kind of sweeten the pot when it comes to the savings? So you'll see, certain markets like California where there aren't state incentives, but power is so expensive there and a lot of areas get a lot of good sun, it's a great solar market. And then, I talk to business owners all the time in places like Massachusetts and Illinois, and they're like, oh, well, solar really going to work for us. We don't get that much sun, but cost of power is very expensive there, and there are state incentives. So those are great solar markets.
So stepping back a little bit in terms of the broader solar appetite, how big is the interest in solar today, and how much has that shifted, say the last 10 years, where it seems like we're starting to hit an inflection point, if we haven't hit it yet, that people obviously, and businesses and consumers alike, are looking more towards alternative sources of power. What are you seeing, given that you're in this market? How big is the appetite today?
Yes, I mean you're so right. So solar is really benefiting from unprecedented tailwinds right now, and it's kind of like a perfect storm of, just different factors that are really feeding that. So for one, there are economic factors, right? So between inflation, the war in Ukraine driving up natural gas prices, the cost of power has gone up everywhere. And in certain markets, it's gone up significantly. And I'm talking like 30, 40%, which just makes the offset that solar can provide that much more appealing. Then you have regulatory factors. So President Biden just signed the Inflation Reduction Act into law in August, and that increased the federal tax incentive that businesses and consumers alike can get from installing solar. So it increased that to 30% of the cost of the system. And it also is keeping that incentive in place for 10 years. And then you also see on the social side. So customers are starting to demand from businesses that they implement more sustainable practices. But lenders and investors are also doing the same thing. We were speaking to a big asset manager recently that invests in a lot of real estate developers and property owners, and they won't make an investment unless that business has an ESG strategy in place. And so solar is a great way to implement something like that, but also save a lot of money.
What are there still some, either one, many impediments to greater adoption? Does it go back to some of the incentives that government maybe don't offer in some states? What are some of the impediments that you still see out there?
So the biggest impediment to date, honestly, has been financing. And so the exact problem that we're trying to solve. So if you look at what happened in the residential market, once these players like GoodLeap, Sunlight Financial, Mosaic came on the market and started offering financing, loan financing for solar, the market just took off in the residential space. In the small to medium commercial space, there's been a relatively low penetration to date, probably like 2%. And we think that that's really driven by the fact that these businesses can't get loan financing for their solar systems. So we hear from our installer partners all the time that they will talk to a commercial customer about potentially installing solar. The customer gets really excited about the economics, and then they go to talk about how they're going to pay for the system. And the business owner says, I'm thinking about installing a $500,000 solar system. I don't want to pay cash. You know, if
Yeah.
I have $500,000 of cash sitting on my balance sheet, I want to hire new people. I want to upgrade my equipment. I want to get more space. You know, it's really focused on how to grow the business, not invest in a solar system. And so Sunstone is enabling them to, you know, do all of those things, but also install solar and save a lot of money.
So what initially, from a personal perspective, sparked your interest in climate? I see it, when going to your LinkedIn and your background, you have a number of years that you've been in the space, whether it be sustainability now with Sunstone. What sparked your interest?
Yeah, so I can actually go all the way back to watching An Inconvenient Truth. I don't know when that came out, like 2007 or something.
Somewhere
It
in
was
there.
so long ago that I actually remember it was back when Netflix still sent you a DVD in the mail, and
Yeah, I
that's how I
remember those
watched it.
days.
Yep, exactly. And I remember watching it and thinking, wow, this is a huge problem. And what can I actually do about it? You know, how can I contribute? How can I help solve it? And at the time, you know, I was working at, you know, Capital One in the credit card division, and that was my skill set and what I brought to the table. And I thought, you know, I don't really have any applicable skills. Like, what am I going to do? But it was always in the back of my mind that, you know, I wanted to work on climate and I wanted to do my part to kind of contribute to what I think is the biggest crisis that humanity has ever faced. And it was really not until, you know, I was on the SPAC team and founding the SPAC that I found an opportunity to leverage my background in financial services, but also, you know, use that role to deploy a lot of money towards a clean energy company. And, you know, I think Sunstone's the same perfect combination, right? It's my interest, my
Mhm.
passion about doing something to help the planet, but also it takes my, you know, it takes the skills that I've developed working in financial services for so long and puts them to good use.
Yeah, as a former banker, former investment banker, it still feels like the traditional financial space has talked a lot about sustainability, ESG, but haven't enacted that much yet. Do you think that that's the case? And do we need a tipping point? It still feels like there's a bit of a divide. Like the younger generation clearly is very much focused on sustainability, the climate, and where where the future of energy comes from. But a lot of the powers that be in traditional finance haven't enacted that much yet. Do you think that that's the case? Do we need a tipping point?
So I don't think anyone has done enough, you know, towards this problem. So that's, you know, banks, governments, me personally. We could all do much more. Like I said, this is the greatest challenge that humanity has ever faced. I, you know, am not putting any, you know, like I'm not putting any caveats or anything on that. I think that is actually, you know, the case. It's an existential threat, and I think we all should be doing much more to combat it. But you know, banks really follow the money, right? And I
Yeah.
think that their investors are really focused on ESG, consumers are really focused on ESG, and you've seen just in the last 10 years a lot of banks and really, you know, every company has implemented some kind of ESG strategy for those reasons. And so, you know, I think that everyone could do more, but I do think that it's real. And I think that it will continue, you know, to grow in importance over time. And I agree with you that it is so inspirational, the younger generations, and how passionate they are about this issue. You know, I think they recognize that it's really going to affect them, or if not them, their children,
Mm-hmm.
and they want to do something about it. And just seeing the amount of energy and enthusiasm towards, you know, kids who are in college or recent grads, they all want to work in this industry. They're really excited about it, and you know, I'm really inspired, and I think that they are going to, you know, do great things and really mitigate this challenge.
You mentioned the tailwinds that solar is that has it that has behind solar these days, but also, for a company like Sunstone, there's been a real shift within fintech, amongst how embedded finance has kind of really taken off. I know that you guys work with a lot of partners as well. And so how much has that larger trend also played into kind of setting up a really good circumstance for Sunstone, and the broader kind of embedded market? What are your thoughts on that? And how much easier are some of your conversations with partners today than maybe they could have been, say, 5 years ago if you were starting that?
I mean, you are so right. I think the fact that if we were trying to start this company 10 years ago, all of these big embedded finance companies that everyone knows and, knows how they work, has probably, used a lot of them at one point in time. They started for the most part like 10 years ago. So this concept of embedded finance, just wasn't really a thing 10 years ago. So I think the fact that everyone has much more familiarity with the concept, and, I don't have to, especially, for your audience, I don't have to come up with some analogy to describe, how we actually sell our product and get it to market. Like, everyone understands the concept of embedded finance. And when we go to talk to investors and potential customers, it's that the conversation goes that much easier, because I think that, everyone is very familiar with that concept.
What's or if not the biggest, one of the biggest lessons that you've learned so far about Sunstone since founding the company with the co-founders?
So, I think that one thing that, I heard someone say at one point that startups are not about ideas, they're about people. And I feel like I've really lived understanding that. So I think if you have a great idea, but the wrong people to execute it, your company is basically worthless, right?
Yeah.
On the flip side, I think if you have amazing people working, for you and with you, even if the idea is not that great, it doesn't matter, because you're going to pivot, you're going to, change what you're doing to fit the market, and you're going to find, the right fit and the right path forward. And I think that we have done a really great job at Sunstone in finding the right people and finding a great team. And the more I spend time with our team, and, we get together, we're a remote company right now. But when we do have the opportunities to get together, there's just so much energy and passion. And I realize that we have the right team in place. So, we're coming up on 2 years of being a company, and really like a little over a year being in market. And there are things that we're going to do that are missteps. Maybe the product that we have right now is not perfect. I'm sure it's not. Our approach to a lot of things isn't. But we have such a great team that I think that we can really do anything. And I think that that's the most important thing.
Is there a regret that you can share since starting the company, a misstep that you can share that you guys have learned from?
I don't know. Like, I can't really think of a regret or a misstep. I definitely think we have, because we have such a great team, we have evolved our products. We've listened to our partners. So, we sell through a network of solar installers across the country who offer our financing to their customers. And, the product that we offered a year ago when we launched is not exactly the same as the product that we have today. And that's because we took feedback from our customers and our partners, and we got changes into market really fast. And it's the same thing with our tech platform. Like what it looked like a year and change ago is like drastically different from how it looks today. Yeah. Because we were able to take feedback and really get, changes implemented quickly that better serve the needs of our customers and partners. So, I think that and we'll continue to evolve, right? I think, in 2 years or 3 years, we'll probably look back at now and say, wow, our installer portal really looked awful back then. But we'll continue to make changes and make things better.
What you mentioned team the last few minutes. How big is the team today? What does the team look like in terms of types of people you have on the team, engineers, sales, kind of what does everyone look like today, and how big is the team?
Yeah, so we're about 35 people, which is incredible because I think we ended 2021 with maybe 12 people. So we've just grown a ton, which has been amazing. Most of our employees are concentrated on 3 teams, I would say. So our engineering and tech team, our business development team, who are out, talking to our installer partners and, signing them up for our platform, and also helping them, fund deals for their customers. And then we have our credit and underwriting team, and they're reviewing our every loan for credit approval, and they're also all of our installers that are signed up on our platform also go through a vetting process. So they're working with installers on that as well. And then we have people in other various capacities as well, but I would say those are kind of the 3 biggest teams.
I saw back in late 22, you had raised around, how was, the fundraising process? Anything specific that you learned during that process? And, what did you, in terms of, the company, how big of a stamp of approval is something like that round, especially in the environment that we're currently living in, which is not, free money like 2020 was. How does that, kind of give the team a jolt?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. So fundraising in this environment was certainly interesting. However, having gone through, SPAC mania of 2020, I feel like
true.
fundraising here was, a walk in the park. So at least it had that going for it. But I think like it's always interesting going out and talking to investors. Like no one wants to hear that their baby is ugly.
Yep.
And so everyone gets a fair amount of that. But I think we found a really amazing partner in Greenbacker Capital. They led our round. We also had some investors from our seed round participate. So Growtech Ventures. And then we have 2 of our bank partners, Cross River Bank and Forbright Bank, who also participated in the round. So I think, it's really exciting to have, an incredible partner in Greenbacker, and then also investors that we know and that, we love working with, kind of validate the business. And I think, we're really excited to have that validation and, have some money in the bank. And really just now it's about going out and executing, which I think we will do very well.
Was there any, it's a fairly new concept in terms of, selling into, the medium-sized business, the solar. I would think investors are a bit more, familiar with the residential side. Was there any skepticism amongst investors like, this isn't possible? This is, a market that's too diverse and strange. What was kind of that appetite from investors during that process, and was there skepticism?
So I think that there's acknowledgement across the board that small business underwriting is more complicated than investment grade commercial underwriting and consumer credit, which is based on FICO, debt to income, those kind of things. So I think everyone acknowledges that. However, small business lending has been around forever. And is a huge segment at a lot of banks. So it's not like you can't lend to small businesses or we don't know how to lend to small businesses.
Yeah.
And so I think that there was acknowledgement of that from investors. And I also like to think of the complexity as a moat, like we were the first to market here. We're, continuing to evolve how we underwrite, and we'll continue to do that. we're also getting great data that no one else has, right, on the small business, solar lending space. And so even if someone were to start a competitor tomorrow, we've got 14, 15 months of data on them that we will continue to use to evolve our credit models and probably make decisions that they won't be able to because we just have better data. So I think that to summarize, I think that it's definitely more challenging than some other segments of the market, but just huge opportunity. Like $1 trillion TAM is what we estimate, and just very low penetration to date. So I think we have a huge opportunity ahead of us.
You mentioned the advice before from David Solomon, the Goldman CEO. If another founder had picked up this episode, what piece of advice would you offer to them, given where your career has been and the lessons that you've taken from Sunstone thus far?
Yeah, I mean, and I really hit on this earlier, but I think it's just a great point to reemphasize, which is just hire a great team. I'll look at a resume and maybe I'm hiring for a role where I'd really love someone to know a coding language, but I have this amazing candidate who is perfect in every other way but doesn't have that experience. Like 10 times out of 10, I'm going to hire that person over the person that has the experience, the exact experience that I'm looking for. But maybe isn't as motivated or as talented and not as passionate about the role in the company. And so I think like just making sure that you surround yourself with great people. Like anyone who is smart and motivated and curious is going to learn how to do the job ahead of that's put in front of them. So I think it's just so important to find the right people.
So we have just a couple minutes left. I like to end a little bit lighter. Do you have a favorite book or the last book that you read?
Yes. So I have a favorite book. My favorite book is The Great Gatsby, actually. And so I first read it when I was like 15 or 16, and it really resonated back then. And I'm not someone I don't like to watch movies more than once. I don't like to visit places more than once. I don't like to read books more than once, but I've actually read that book probably 4 or 5 times every 5 years or so. And every time I read it, there's something new that I appreciate about it. And I appreciate the way that Fitzgerald writes characters. And I feel like he just gets people so well. So after having a bunch of life experience, I just noticed like how much more the book resonates. And having lived over, almost 10 years in New York, I've definitely met a few Gatsbys and a few Daisy Buchanans. And then recently, I actually read another great book, which is called The Water Will Come by Jeff Goodell. And that's actually, very relevant to Sunstone. It's about climate change and rising sea levels and how it's going to impact the cities that we live in. And I live in Miami currently, so very relevant for me.
Well, you are the second co-founder that I've interviewed that has selected the Gatsby book. The other one was a Grain. The company was called Grain, and the co-founder Carl also referenced that as his favorite book. Founders, obviously, you need to stay fresh. You can't burn yourself out, though. Founders typically work very long hours. What do you do to unwind, step away, kind of clear your head, make sure that you're fresh for the team, for your fellow employees?
Yes. So I love to take walks. And I try to walk, every day for about an hour. It really clears my head. I do my best thinking on those walks, and I live right by the beach. So it's just beautiful environment and very inspirational to kind of be in nature and just appreciate the beauty of my surroundings, and also, think about whatever it is I need to ponder for that day.
Do you have a favorite sport team that you root for?
I do not follow sports at all, but we are a Baltimore-based company, so I will say go Ravens.
It's it's there's a reason why I asked the question, and because I'm a big sports fan, but I'd probably say 90% of the, I think 85 interviews I've done now, the founder or co-founder never watches like the typical sport. Founders are usually their heads and the way they think is usually different. And so I'm always curious what people's answers are to that question.
Yeah, it's interesting. I appreciate sports. I love going to football games, baseball games. I went to the Formula One race in Miami actually in May, which was really cool. I'd never experienced that before. So I can appreciate people who are kind of at the top skill level of what they're doing. But I've never really been passionate about sports. And now I'm realizing I said go Ravens. And if my dad happens to listen to this, I have to say go Red Sox because that's his team.
That's okay. They're different sports. So I think you're safe there. Do you have a favorite vacation spot?
So, like I said, I don't necessarily like to go to places more than once. I do love to travel, and I've always tried to go to more countries than my age. I think that I've maybe fallen off since during COVID. I didn't get to travel as much as I'd like to, but I pick one particularly memorable trip that I did take, and it was about 7 years ago at this point, which was to Israel. And I think what I loved about that trip is that no place has really made me think as much as Israel. It's just such an amazing place from, modern politics, but also the history and the religious significance. It's really just a fascinating place. And I feel like it caused me to have, deep thought about a lot of different things.
And then final question, biggest inspiration in life or what inspires you?
Yeah, so I love nature, and I think actually as I've gotten older, I've started to appreciate it more. So I mentioned walking along the beach. I love being in the mountains. I'm actually about to take off for Wyoming. I'm gonna be living out there for a couple months, and just I found yeah, it's just breathtaking out there in the Rockies. And so I get a lot of inspiration from nature, and I also love animals. I love to see, I went on safari in Africa several years ago, and it was just the most interesting thing. And so I just love being in nature, and yeah, I get very inspired by it.
Well, Susan, I appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you for your time today. If someone wanted to reach out and get in touch with either you or Sunstone, how can they do that?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm at just Susan.Tanski at sunstonecredit.com. So, very easy to reach out to me that way. And then there's definitely a way to send a note to others at our company on the website. We're just at sunstonecredit.com. And feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn too.
All right. Sounds good. Continued success to you and the team. And thanks again for stopping by.
Thanks so much, Todd. It was great to be here.